The vampire king caught the maid's daughter hiding in the pantry, devouring yesterday's scraps with dirt-streaked fingers. She looked up, eyes wide with terror. But instead of punishment, he knelt beside her, pushed a full plate forward, and whispered the one question that would unravel his carefully guarded secret. The castle corridors stretched endlessly in the darkness, their stone walls absorbing sound like hungry mouths, and Alaric moved through them with the practiced silence of 3 centuries, his boots making no whisper against the polished floors as he conducted his nightly inspection of the grounds. The routine had become mechanical over the decades, a series of checkpoints he visited more from habit than necessity. Because what threats could penetrate a fortress ruled by a vampire king who had crushed rebellions and outlasted entire dynasties through sheer, relentless immortality? Tonight felt no different from the 1,000 nights before it, the air carrying the familiar scents of beeswax candles and aged wood, the distant sounds of servants finishing their final tasks before retreating to whatever cramped quarters they occupied in the bowels of his magnificent estate. He passed the grand dining hall where he'd entertained visiting dignitaries earlier that evening, the table still laden with half-eaten delicacies that would be cleared away by invisible hands before dawn, and continued toward the kitchens where the night staff would be cleaning the last of the copper pots and banking the fires. But then he heard it. A sound so faint that mortal ears would have missed it entirely, a desperate scraping like rats in the walls, coming from the servants' pantry just beyond the main kitchen. Alaric paused, his predatory instincts sharpening automatically, because unauthorized activity in his castle demanded investigation regardless of how trivial it might prove to be. He changed direction, moving toward the pantry door that stood slightly ajar, a sliver of candlelight leaking into the darkened hallway. The scraping continued, punctuated now by small, wet sounds that made him think of animals feeding, and he pushed the door open silently, his vampire vision adjusting instantly to the dim interior. What he saw made him stop completely, every muscle in his body going rigid, with an emotion he couldn't immediately name. A child crouched behind a tower of flour sacks, her small body hunched over like a feral creature protecting a kill, and she was cramming food into her mouth with both hands, her fingers black with grime as they scooped congealed gravy from a cracked bowl and shoved stale bread past her lips faster than she could chew. Her dress hung on her frame like a burial shroud, so threadbare that he could see the sharp ridges of her ribs through the fabric, each bone clearly defined against skin that looked gray in the candlelight. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, this tiny, savage thing eating garbage in his pantry. And even as he watched, she grabbed a heel of bread so hard it had gone green at the edges and tore into it with teeth that seemed too large for her sunken face. The pantry itself mocked her desperation with its abundance, shelves upon shelves of preserved meats and imported spices, and wheels of cheese the size of carriage wheels. Enough food to feed a village for a month stored in careful rows, while this child devoured scraps that should have been thrown to the pigs. Alaric felt anger rising in his chest, hot and immediate, because someone had failed in their duties if servants' children were reduced to scavenging like rats, and he was preparing to call for the head of household staff when the girl looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. She froze mid-bite, a piece of bread protruding from her mouth and gravy dripping down her chin in thick brown rivulets, and the expression that crossed her face drove the anger from his body like water-dousing flames. She looked at him with absolute terror, the kind of fear that expected death to follow discovery, her eyes enormous in her gaunt face and her whole body trembling so violently that the bread fell from her nerveless fingers. Those eyes held something that reached across 300 years and grabbed him by the throat, something he recognized from a life he'd spent centuries trying to forget. And suddenly he wasn't a vampire king standing in his castle pantry, but a 9-year-old boy, watching his father's hands shake as they divided a single potato between 5 people. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, even though he hadn't needed to breathe for longer than this child had been alive, and he found himself moving without conscious decision. his joints creaking audibly as he lowered himself to kneel on the cold stone floor. The girl flinched backward, pressing herself against the flour sacks as though she could disappear into them, and he saw now that she was Margaret's daughter, the head maid who scrubbed his floors until they gleamed like mirrors, and never once met his eyes when she worked. He'd noticed the woman's excellence, but never thought to look beyond it, never wondered about the life she led when she wasn't polishing his silver or beating dust from his carpets, and the shame of that indifference sat in his stomach like lead. There was a servant's dinner plate on a nearby shelf, still warm from the kitchen fires, and Alaric reached for it slowly, making his movements obvious and unthreatening as he slid it across the floor toward the terrified child. She stared at the plate as though it might bite her hands clutching the moldy bread to her chest like treasure, and he realized she didn't understand that he was offering it rather than using it as some kind of trap. The candlelight flickered across her face, illuminating features that should have been soft with childhood, but instead looked ancient with hunger, and he heard himself whisper a question that felt like pulling glass from his own throat. "When did you last eat a full meal?" The words hung in the air between them, and he watched her process them, saw the exact moment she understood that he wanted an answer rather than simply demanding she leave or threatening punishment for theft. Her voice came out as barely more than a breath, cracked and small. "3 days ago, Your Majesty." She said it like a confession, like admitting to some terrible crime, and then the words spilled out faster as though she couldn't stop them once they'd started. "Mama gives me her portions, but she needs them more. She's been so tired, she works from before dawn until after dark, and her hands bleed sometimes from the lye soap, and I told her I wasn't hungry, but she knew I was lying." Alaric felt his jaw tighten, felt his fangs threatening to extend in response to the rage building behind his ribs, but he kept his voice level when he asked about the kitchen staff. The girl's eyes dropped to the floor, and she whispered that children ate after everyone else, that there was never anything left by the time the adults had finished, that the cook said growing bodies didn't need as much food as working ones. The lies were so transparent, so casually cruel, that Alaric had to close his eyes for a moment to master himself, because the urge to go into the kitchen and tear out every throat he found there was nearly overwhelming. When he opened his eyes again, the girl was watching him with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that might have been hope, if hope weren't such a dangerous thing for someone in her position to feel. The pantry felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as he became aware of every detail with the hyper-clarity of his vampire senses. The way shadows danced across shelves packed with food that cost more than most people earned in a year. The sickly sweet smell of spoiling vegetables mixing with the harsh bite of spices from distant lands. The sound of the kitchen staff laughing about something in the next room while this child had been eating garbage mere feet away from their oblivious celebration. Outside the pantry, the castle hummed with its evening routines, hundreds of lives moving through their prescribed patterns without the slightest awareness that something fundamental had just shifted in the darkness, that their king had just discovered a crack in the foundation of everything he'd built over 3 centuries of rule. Alaric looked at the girl's dirt-streaked fingers, at the gravy drying on her chin, at the threadbare dress that couldn't possibly keep her warm in the castle's stone corridors. And he saw himself, saw the boy he'd been before he'd made the desperate bargain that had transformed him into something that couldn't starve, couldn't suffer, couldn't be reduced to stealing scraps just to survive another day. That boy had died the night he'd accepted vampirism, had been burned away in the transformation that had promised him power and safety and an end to the grinding, soul-crushing poverty that had killed his father and would have killed him too if he'd remained human. He'd spent 300 years believing that death had been a mercy, that becoming a monster was preferable to remaining a victim. But looking at this child, he felt the ghost of that long-dead boy stirring in his chest, demanding to know what the point of all that power had been if he'd simply built a prettier version of the same cruelty he'd escaped. The question he'd asked her still hung in the air, unanswered in any meaningful way, because knowing she'd last eaten 3 days ago told him when, but not why. Didn't explain the systems and choices and casual indifference that had brought her to this moment. Crouched in his pantry, eating garbage while he'd been upstairs, discussing trade agreements over wine that cost more than her mother's annual wages. Emma, he remembered suddenly. Her name was Emma because Margaret had mentioned her daughter once while cleaning, had said something about the girl being clever with numbers, and he'd nodded absently without really hearing because servants' children were invisible to him, had always been invisible. Were meant to be invisible so that people like him could move through their lives without the inconvenient weight of other people's suffering. But Emma was visible now, terrifyingly visible, and as Alaric knelt on the cold pantry floor with his 300-year-old joints protesting and a plate of food growing cold between them, he felt something inside himself crack open, something he'd kept carefully sealed since the night he'd stopped being human, and he knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his carefully ordered world was going to survive what came next. The glamour settled over Alaric's features like a second skin, ancient magic reshaping his aristocratic face into something unremarkable and worn. The kind of face that disappeared in crowds and drew no attention from those who considered themselves important. And he examined his reflection in the darkened window of his private chambers before descending into the bowels of his own castle, disguised as the very thing he'd spent 3 centuries avoiding being. The transformation went deeper than appearance, dulling the predatory grace of his movements until he shuffled like someone whose body had been broken by years of hard labor, hunching his shoulders in the universal posture of people who'd learned that making yourself smaller sometimes meant surviving another day. He'd chosen the night shift in the kitchens for his first assignment, reasoning that food was the heart of what he'd witnessed in the pantry, and when he presented himself to the head cook as a temporary worker sent from the lower estates, the man barely glanced at him before shouting instructions about which pots needed scrubbing and where the lye soap was kept. The kitchen at night was a different world from the gleaming workspace he'd occasionally pass through during daylight hours. The floors slick with grease and rotting vegetable matter, the air thick with smoke from fires that burned too hot because the flues hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Alaric took his place at the washing station beside 2 other servants, their hands raw and bleeding from the caustic soap, and began the mind-numbing work of scouring pots, while conversations flowed around him as though he weren't there. Within an hour, he'd learned more about the actual functioning of his household than he had in decades of rule, because servants talked freely around other servants, sharing information and complaints with the easy intimacy of people who only had each other to rely on. The kitchen staff operated on a strict hierarchy that had nothing to do with official positions and everything to do with access to resources, with the head cook at the top controlling not just meal preparation, but the entire flow of food through the castle, deciding who ate what and when and how much. Alaric watched with growing horror as perfectly good food was set aside in special containers, later learning these would be sold in the village market, with the profits divided among the senior kitchen staff. While the meals prepared for lower servants consisted of whatever scraps remained after the nobility and upper staff had taken their fill. The children weren't mentioned in any meal planning at all, their existence apparently so far beneath notice that no one even bothered to account for their needs. And when Alaric carefully asked about feeding protocols, he was told that brats ate whatever their parents gave them from personal portions. He worked through the night, his vampire constitution making the physical labor trivial even while glamoured, but he forced himself to move slowly and rest periodically the way the human workers did, watching everything with eyes that saw in perfect clarity even in the darkest corners. By dawn, he'd witnessed the morning meal preparation, had seen the stark difference between the platters sent upstairs laden with fresh bread and butter and cream, and the thin gruel ladled into wooden bowls for the servants who'd worked all night, had watched those same exhausted workers gulp down their inadequate breakfast before beginning another shift, because there was no rest period built into the schedules. The next night, he worked in the laundry, a steaming hell in the castle's lowest level where women stood for 12 hours at a time scrubbing linens in water hot enough to boil meat, their hands wrapped in rags that did little to protect against the scalding temperatures and harsh chemicals. Margaret was there, and seeing her through the eyes of a fellow servant, rather than as his king self, revealed a woman who was being systematically destroyed by her employment. Her shoulders permanently hunched from bending over washing tubs, her fingers gnarled and scarred from years of lye burns, her face gaunt with the kind of exhaustion that came from never having enough food or sleep or hope. She worked with mechanical efficiency, scrubbing his silk sheets until they gleamed while wearing a dress so worn it was nearly transparent. And during the brief meal break, Alaric watched her accept her portion of bread and watery soup, eat exactly 3 bites, then carefully wrap the rest in a scrap of cloth to take back to her quarters. The other laundry workers noticed, and one of them, a older woman with kind eyes, touched Margaret's arm gently and told her she needed to eat, that she was getting too thin, that Emma would rather have a living mother than an extra bite of bread. Margaret's response was barely audible over the sound of boiling water and scrubbing, but Alaric's vampire hearing caught every word as she said that Emma was growing and needed the food more, that children shouldn't have to feel hunger the way they did, that she could manage on less if it meant her daughter didn't cry herself to sleep with stomach cramps. The rage that filled Alaric in that moment was unlike anything he'd experienced in centuries, a hot, choking fury that made his glamour flicker dangerously as his true nature threatened to burst through, and he had to step outside into the corridor and stand in the darkness until he could master himself enough to maintain the disguise. He returned to find Margaret collapsed over her washing tub, unconscious from exhaustion and malnutrition, and watched as the other workers revived her with cold water and propped her back on her feet, because stopping work wasn't permitted no matter how close to death someone might be. The laundry supervisor, a bitter woman who'd clearly climbed to her position by being more vicious than compassionate, told Margaret that if she fainted again, she'd lose a day's wages. And Margaret nodded silently and went back to scrubbing with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the brush. Alaric worked beside her for the rest of the shift, and when it finally ended 16 hours after it had begun, he followed at a distance as she made her way to the servants' quarters, carrying her wrapped portion of food like it was made of gold. The servants' quarters existed in the part of the castle Alaric had never visited, a warren of cramped rooms carved into the foundation stones where the cold seeped through walls, and no amount of fire could banish the damp. Margaret shared a single room with Emma and 3 other servant families, the space divided by hanging sheets that provided the illusion of privacy, but nothing else. And Alaric watched through a crack in the door as she woke her sleeping daughter and pressed the food into her hands. Emma tried to refuse, her young voice insisting that her mother needed to eat, but Margaret stroked her hair and lied with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years, claiming she'd already eaten her fill at dinner. The girl was too hungry to argue for long, and Alaric watched her devour the bread and soup while her mother sat beside her smiling, as though watching her child eat was better than any meal she could have consumed herself. When Emma fell asleep, Margaret allowed herself to cry, silent tears tracking down her face as she ran her ruined hands over her daughter's too thin body, and Alaric had to walk away before he lost control entirely and started killing people. He spent the following nights working in the stables, the gardens, the groundskeeping crews, and everywhere he went, he found the same brutal caste system replicating itself like a disease, with those who had power hoarding resources, while those below them fought over scraps. The stable master ate better than some minor nobles, while the boys who actually mucked out the stalls and cared for the horses subsisted on moldy bread and whatever they could steal when no one was watching. The head gardener sold the best produce in the village market, while his workers were forbidden from eating even the vegetables that were too ugly to serve at the master's table. Every department had created its own internal hierarchy of suffering, with those at the top justifying their cruelty as maintaining order, and those at the bottom too exhausted and starved to rebel. And the children, when Alaric finally let himself see them, were everywhere and nowhere. Invisible ghosts haunting the edges of adult spaces, their bodies twisted by malnutrition, and their eyes old with understanding that the world had no place for them. He saw Emma multiple times during his investigation, once stealing vegetable peels from the compost heap behind the kitchens and eating them raw, dirt and rot and all, her small hands moving quickly as though she expected to be caught and punished. Another time he watched the head cook throw an entire basket of fresh bread to the hunting dogs while Emma stood in the kitchen doorway, her hollow eyes following every piece as it disappeared into eager canine mouths. And the cook noticed her watching and laughed, making some joke about beggars and choosers that made the other kitchen staff chuckle while Emma faded back into the shadows. Alaric's hands shook so badly in that moment that he dropped the pot he'd been scrubbing, and the crash brought the cook's attention to him instead, a barked reprimand about clumsiness and threats of docked wages that Alaric absorbed without response, because speaking would have meant screaming, and screaming would have led to tearing out throats. At night, after his shifts ended, and he'd returned to his chambers and dropped the glamour, Alaric began a second mission, wrapping food from his own untouched meals in plain cloth and leaving it outside the servants' quarters in places where it would be found, but not traced back to him. The parcels always disappeared by morning, and he imagined Emma eating them, imagined her face less gaunt and her eyes less haunted, and the fantasy sustained him through council meetings, where he found himself unable to concentrate on trade agreements and border disputes because his mind was full of images of children eating garbage. His advisors noticed his distraction, exchanging concerned glances when he asked them to repeat themselves multiple times or when he stared out windows instead of reviewing documents, but Alaric couldn't bring himself to care about their concerns when he was carrying the weight of knowledge that was destroying him from the inside. During the day, he was the vampire king, sitting on his throne and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. And during the night, he was a nameless servant, discovering that his kingdom was built on systematic cruelty that everyone knew about and no one questioned. He overheard two kitchen maids talking while he scrubbed floors, their voices carrying clearly in the pre-dawn quiet, as one said that the vampire didn't care what happened below stairs, that servants were replaceable, and the other agreed and added that Margaret's girl wouldn't last the winter because she was too weak. They discussed Emma's probable death with the same casual tone they might use to discuss the weather, and Alaric realized that to them this was normal, that children dying of starvation in a castle full of food was just how things were and always had been. He confronted his steward the next day, dropping his royal mask long enough to ask directly how long the current feeding policies had been in place, and the man looked confused by the question, as though Alaric had asked about the color of the sky. "Generations, Your Majesty," the steward replied. "Since before your time, it maintains order," and there was no guilt in his voice, no awareness that he was describing atrocity, just the bland certainty of someone explaining established procedure. Alaric dismissed him before the urge to commit violence became irresistible, and he sat alone in his chambers, looking at his hands, and remembering how they'd once been a starving child's hands, small and desperate, and always reaching for food that wasn't there. He'd transformed himself into a creature that couldn't starve, had built an empire on the assumption that power equaled safety, and somewhere in those 300 years, he'd recreated the exact conditions he'd suffered under, had become the lord in the castle while children starved in his basement. The knowledge sat in his chest like acid, burning through the careful distances he'd maintained between himself and his subjects, and he knew that he couldn't unknow what he'd learned, couldn't return to the comfortable ignorance that had allowed him to rule without seeing. Emma had become more than one starving child in his mind, had transformed into a symbol of every failure and every cruelty he'd permitted through indifference, and his obsession with fixing what he'd discovered was no longer about justice, but about redemption, about proving to himself that the boy he'd been hadn't died for nothing when he'd accepted vampirism. But redemption required destruction first. required tearing down the systems that had grown like cancer through his household, and Alaric could feel that confrontation approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and catastrophic. And he found himself almost eager for it, despite knowing that what came next would reshape everything he'd built and possibly destroy him in the process. Alaric was reviewing reports in his private study when he heard the sound, so faint that at first he thought he'd imagined it, a soft thump against wood like something small and fragile collapsing against his chamber door. He rose from his desk with the preternatural speed of his kind, crossed the room in 3 strides, and pulled open the heavy oak door to find Emma crumpled on the floor outside, her body curled into itself like a dying insect, her skin so pale it looked translucent in the torchlight. For a moment he simply stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing, because finding a servant child unconscious outside his private chambers made no sense, violated every protocol and boundary that separated his world from theirs. But then, training overrode shock, and he dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her body as he tried to assess the damage without causing more harm. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her lips cracked and bleeding, her pulse so weak he had to press his fingers against her throat to find it at all. And when he carefully turned her over, he saw that her eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only whites that gleamed like bone in the flickering light. She was burning with fever despite the castle's chill, her skin radiating heat that spoke of a body consuming itself for fuel it didn't have, and Alaric realized with dawning horror that she'd collapsed from simple starvation, that her system had finally given up after weeks or months or possibly years of inadequate nutrition. He scooped her into his arms, shocked by how little she weighed, how her bones felt like bird skeletons wrapped in paper-thin skin, and he carried her into his chambers knowing that this was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, that bringing a servant child into the vampire king's private rooms would cause scandal and speculation and probably political consequences he couldn't begin to predict. But those concerns felt distant and unimportant compared to the child dying in his arms. So he kicked the door shut behind him and carried Emma to the massive armchair by the fireplace, settling her into cushions that probably cost more than everything her mother owned combined. The fire was already burning, filling the room with warmth and golden light that made the luxury surrounding them almost obscene. The velvet furniture and priceless tapestries and walls lined with books collected over centuries of immortal existence, creating a stark contrast to the skeletal child who looked like she belonged in a pauper's grave rather than a king's chambers. Alaric laid her down as gently as he could, then moved to the side table where he kept a decanter of brandy and discovered his hands were shaking, actually trembling like a human's hands might, and he had to stop and breathe even though breathing was optional for him, had been optional for 300 years. He forced himself to focus, to think through what Emma needed, rather than spiraling into the panic that threatened to overwhelm his usual iron control. And he remembered that the kitchens kept broth warming on the fires at all hours for late-night requests from nobility. He used the bell pull to summon a servant, and when a sleepy footman appeared, Alaric ordered broth and bread and tea without explanation, his tone making it clear that questions would not be tolerated, and the man scurried away, leaving Alaric alone with Emma's unconscious form. While he waited, he wrapped her in furs from his own bed, thick pelts from animals that had been hunted in forests 1,000 miles away, and he built up the fire until the room was almost uncomfortably warm by his standards, which meant it might be barely adequate for a sick human child. The food arrived within minutes, the footman's eyes going wide when he saw Emma in the king's chair, but wisely keeping silent as he set down the tray and retreated, and Alaric knew that by morning the entire castle would know about this, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He settled himself on the floor beside the chair, bringing himself to Emma's level the way he had in the pantry, and he dipped a silver spoon into the broth and brought it to her cracked lips. She didn't respond at first, her head lolling to the side, and he had to support her skull with one hand while using the other to carefully part her lips and let drops of warm liquid trickle into her mouth. Her throat worked reflexively, swallowing without conscious thought, and encouraged by this small success, Alaric continued the painstaking process of feeding her one tiny spoonful at a time. Her eyes fluttered open eventually, unfocused and glassy with fever, and she stared at him without recognition, her gaze sliding past his face as though she were looking at something only she could see. He kept feeding her, murmuring encouragement in a voice he barely recognized as his own, something soft and gentle that he hadn't used since he'd been human himself, and gradually her swallowing became more deliberate, less reflexive, as though some part of her was clawing its way back toward consciousness. But consciousness brought delirium with it, the fever burning through her brain and scrambling her thoughts. And when she finally focused on his face, her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered a word that stopped his heart. "Papa," she said, her voice cracking on the syllable, and Alaric felt something inside his chest fracture, some carefully maintained wall that had been holding back 3 centuries of suppressed emotion, suddenly developing cracks that spread like lightning through glass. He opened his mouth to correct her, to explain that he wasn't her father, but the words wouldn't come, because she was looking at him with such desperate hope, such pure relief at not being alone, and he found himself nodding instead, found himself saying yes, I'm here, found himself becoming whatever she needed him to be in this moment. Emma's hand found his, her fingers like twigs as they wrapped around his thumb, and she pulled his hand to her face and pressed it against her burning cheek. "Papa, I'm so hungry," she whispered, the words slurring together as fever and exhaustion made speech difficult. "Why did they take you away? I waited for you, but you never came back, and Mama cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." The words tumbled out of her in a disjointed stream, a child's understanding of trauma she was too young to fully process, and Alaric found himself learning about a man he'd never known, a servant named Thomas, who'd worked in his stables and had a wife and daughter, and not enough food to keep them all alive. Emma's fevered memories painted a picture of a father who'd done everything he could, who'd given his own portions to his family until he'd grown too weak to work properly, who'd finally stolen a loaf of bread from the kitchen stores in an act of desperate necessity. The head of household staff had made an example of him, Emma whispered, had called the guards and pressed charges of theft, and Alaric's own justice system had sentenced Thomas to death because the penalty for stealing from the nobility was execution, and no one had thought to question whether the law should apply differently when a man was stealing to feed his starving child. "Papa promised me I'd never be hungry again," Emma said, her eyes drifting closed as the broth in her stomach made her drowsy. "He said he'd fix everything and we'd have enough food and I'd grow up big and strong. But then the soldiers came and Mama was screaming, and I didn't understand why everyone was crying." Alaric felt wetness on his face and realized with shock that he was crying, actual tears running down his cheeks for the first time in 200 years, maybe longer, silent tears that he didn't know how to stop or control. He'd forgotten he could cry, had assumed that particular human weakness had been burned away in his transformation, but apparently grief deep enough could resurrect even abilities he'd thought lost forever. "I'm here now," he heard himself say, his voice breaking on the words. "You'll never be hungry again, I promise." And even as he said it, he knew he was making the same promise Emma's father had made, the same promise that had led to a good man's execution. "That's what Papa said before the soldiers came," Emma murmured, already half asleep, the broth and warmth and furs conspiring to pull her under into something deeper than the unconsciousness that had brought her here. And Alaric held her hand and watched her face relax into sleep while his mind raced through the implications of what she'd revealed. He'd killed her father. Not personally, but through the system he'd created and maintained, through laws he'd never thought to examine, because why would a vampire king concern himself with the theft of bread? Thomas had died because Alaric had been too distant, too removed, too convinced that maintaining order required harsh penalties for even minor infractions. And the man's widow had been left to raise their daughter alone in a system designed to grind people like them into dust. Margaret's exhaustion and Emma's starvation were direct consequences of choices Alaric had made or allowed others to make in his name, and the weight of that responsibility felt crushing, felt like it might actually destroy him despite his immortal constitution. He looked around his chambers, really looked at them for the first time in decades, seeing the obscene wealth represented in every tapestry and book and piece of furniture, calculating in his head how many families could be fed for a year on what he'd spent on a single rug. Emma slept in his chair, impossibly small against the massive cushions, wrapped in furs that represented more money than her father had earned in his entire short life, and the contrast was so grotesque that Alaric felt physically ill despite vampires not being capable of nausea. The fire cast warm light across her face, illuminating features that were slowly gaining color as the broth worked its way through her system. But it also threw shadows that pooled in her sunken cheeks and made her look like a corpse, like she was already dead, and this was just her ghost haunting him. He thought about his own father, a memory he'd successfully avoided for 3 centuries, a man whose face he could barely remember, but whose death he recalled in perfect detail. His father had been hanged for stealing food too, strung up in the village square while 9-year-old Alaric watched and learned that the world had no mercy for people born into the wrong circumstances. The lesson had been clear even to a child, that powerlessness meant death, that the only way to survive was to become powerful enough that no one could ever do to you what had been done to your father. So when the vampire had found him weeks later, half dead from starvation and willing to make any bargain that promised survival, Alaric had accepted the offer of immortality without hesitation, had let himself be transformed into something that couldn't starve, couldn't be hanged, couldn't be broken by the casual cruelty of those who had, while he had not. "I became a monster to escape this," he whispered to the sleeping child, "and I've created it in my own house. I've become the lord in the castle while children die the way I almost died. I've spent 300 years running from my father's death, only to create the exact conditions that killed him." The words felt like confession, like admitting to sins so enormous that no penance could possibly balance them, and Alaric knew that everything he'd built over centuries of rule was rotten at the foundation, corrupted by the same indifference and cruelty he'd once suffered under. Emma stirred in her sleep, her hand tightening around his thumb, and he looked down at their joined hands and saw the absurdity of it. A vampire king who'd conquered nations holding hands with a starving servant child in front of a fire that cost more to maintain than most people earned in a month. But it didn't feel absurd. It felt necessary, felt like the first honest thing he'd done in longer than he could remember, and the promise he'd made to her echoed in his mind with the weight of prophecy. "You'll never be hungry again," he'd said, and he'd meant it as comfort for a dying child. But he could feel the words reshaping themselves into something bigger, a vow that would require destroying everything he'd carefully constructed over 3 centuries of immortal rule. Because keeping Emma fed meant dismantling the systems that starved her, meant confronting the casual cruelty built into every level of his household, meant admitting that his entire approach to governance had been designed to protect him from ever feeling powerless again while creating the exact powerlessness for others. The realization should have been devastating, should have sent him spiraling into despair or rage, but instead, Alaric felt something almost like relief, like he'd been holding his breath for 300 years and could finally exhale. He'd lost something fundamental when he'd accepted vampirism, had traded his humanity for power, and told himself it was worth the cost. But sitting here with Emma sleeping in his chair, he could feel that lost humanity stirring, could feel the 9-year-old boy he'd been demanding to know what the point of surviving had been if he'd just become another version of the monsters who'd killed his father. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and outside the windows, Alaric could see dawn approaching, the sky lightening from black to gray, to the faint promise of blue. Emma would wake soon, would need more food and probably medical attention, and certainly explanations for why she'd woken in the Vampire King's private chambers. But for now, she slept peacefully, her breathing steady, and her face relaxed in a way he'd never seen before. Alaric sat beside her chair and held her hand and felt the last of his carefully maintained emotional distance crumble into dust, felt himself becoming dangerous in an entirely new way, because a vampire king who didn't care about his servants was predictable and controllable, but a vampire king who decided to burn down his own systems to save one starving child was something else entirely, was a force that would reshape everything it touched, regardless of the consequences. Alaric had not slept, had spent the hours between Emma's collapse and Dawn sitting beside her as she recovered, watching color return to her face, while his mind constructed and discarded a dozen different approaches to what had to come next. And by the time the sun rose, he'd settled on the only option that made sense, even though it would likely destroy everything he'd built over 3 centuries of careful rule. He sent word before breakfast that there would be an emergency council meeting, mandatory attendance for all nobles currently in residence and all department heads, the kind of summons that hadn't been issued in decades, and immediately set the castle buzzing with speculation and worry. Emma had woken at dawn, confused and frightened to find herself in chambers she recognized as belonging to the king, and Alaric had fed her more broth and bread while explaining in simple terms that things were going to change, that she was safe now, that he needed her to trust him for a few hours, even though what he was about to do would be terrifying. She'd listened with those enormous eyes, still weak but already sharper than most adults he knew, and when he'd asked if she could be brave, she'd nodded solemnly and said that Mama had taught her how to be brave when things were scary. He'd dressed her in clothes borrowed from the castle's seamstress, a simple dress in deep blue that actually fit her skeletal frame, and he'd had a servant bring Margaret to his chambers. Watching the woman's face cycle through terror and confusion and finally stunned disbelief as he explained that her daughter had collapsed, that he'd found her, that Emma was safe and would remain so. Margaret had wept and tried to apologize, and Alaric had stopped her with a raised hand, telling her that the only people who needed to apologize were the ones who'd created a system where mothers had to choose between feeding their children and feeding themselves, and that she would understand everything soon. Now he sat on his throne with Emma standing beside him, his hand resting on her thin shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and deliberately provocative, because every person in this room would understand the implications of a servant child standing at the right hand of the vampire king. The throne room was packed, nobility filling the space in their silks and jewels, like a garden of poisonous flowers, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and concern, because emergency councils usually meant war or plague or some other crisis that threatened their comfortable existence. The servants had been allowed to line the walls, another unprecedented break from protocol, and Alaric could see Margaret among them, her work-ruined hands clutched to her chest as she stared at her daughter standing beside the most powerful creature in the kingdom. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting patterns of colored light across marble floors polished to mirror brightness, and the beauty of the room felt like mockery, given what Alaric was about to reveal. His vampire advisors stood closest to the throne, immortals who'd served him for decades or centuries, their ageless faces showing the first hints of concern as they registered Emma's presence and tried to understand what it meant. Lord Hadrian occupied his usual position of prominence, a vampire noble who'd been instrumental in establishing the current household hierarchy and who Alaric knew would oppose any changes to systems that benefited him personally. The human nobility clustered in their own section, minor lords and ladies who owed their positions to Alaric's favor, and who'd grown fat on the privileges that came with proximity to power. Department heads from across the castle stood nervously near the back. The head cook and head of household staff and stable master, and all the others who actually ran the daily operations, and Alaric could see guilt and fear warring on some of their faces, because they had to suspect why they'd been summoned. He let the silence stretch, let the tension build until people began shifting uncomfortably and exchanging worried glances. And then he began speaking in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast room without him having to raise it. He told them about finding Emma in the pantry, about discovering that a child was starving in his own castle, and he watched their faces as the implications registered. Watched some look away in shame, while others showed only confusion, as though the suffering of servants was too far beneath their notice to constitute a real problem. He described his investigation, the week spent glamored as a servant, learning how his household actually functioned versus how he'd believed it functioned. And with each revelation, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, more charged with an electricity that felt dangerous. He detailed the corruption in the kitchens, the theft and resale of food meant for servants, the systematic starvation of children who were considered too unimportant to merit proper feeding, and he named names, pointing to specific individuals who'd profited from the suffering of those they were supposed to manage. The head cook's face went purple with rage and fear, and the head of household staff actually tried to leave before Alaric's guards blocked the doors, making it clear that no one was going anywhere until this was finished. Then Alaric began announcing his reforms, his voice taking on the quality of tempered steel as he laid out changes that would reshape the entire structure of castle life. Equal food rations for all inhabitants regardless of rank, he declared, with portions calculated based on actual nutritional needs rather than social status, and dedicated meal times for children with food prepared specifically for growing bodies. Education for all servants' children in reading and mathematics and trades, taught by tutors he would hire specifically for that purpose, and an end to the practice of children working before the age of 12. Immediate investigations into every department with authority to dismiss and criminally prosecute anyone found to be embezzling or abusing their positions, and new oversight structures to prevent future corruption. The throne room erupted before he'd finished, voices rising in protest and outrage, nobles shouting over each other about tradition and precedent and the natural order of things. Lord Hadrian's voice cut through the chaos, demanding to know what had possessed the king to upend centuries of established practice over one servant's child, and Alaric felt his hand tighten on Emma's shoulder as he fixed the vampire lord with a stare that had made stronger creatures back down. But Hadrian was old and arrogant and apparently suicidal because he continued, saying that while the situation was regrettable, overreaction would cause more problems than it solved, that servants understood their place and didn't expect to be treated as equals, that this kind of radical change would destabilize everything they'd built. "Your Majesty," Hadrian said with the kind of patronizing tone that assumed familiarity gave him license to speak freely, "this sets a dangerous precedent. The girl is a servant's bastard, and elevating her sends entirely the wrong message to the lower classes." The temperature in the room dropped as Alaric rose from his throne, moving with the inhuman speed that reminded everyone present exactly what he was. And he was in front of Hadrian before the vampire lord could blink, his eyes blazing red and his fangs fully extended. "Watch your tongue," Alaric said, his voice dropping to something that was barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than shouting. "Emma is under my personal protection, and I am declaring her my ward with all rights and privileges that entails. Insult her again, and you'll learn why I've ruled for 3 centuries while older and supposedly stronger vampires turned to dust." Hadrian stumbled backward, his own eyes flashing red in automatic response to the threat. But he wasn't stupid enough to actually challenge a vampire king in his own throne room. So he bowed stiffly and retreated into the crowd. Alaric returned to his throne, deliberately placing his hand back on Emma's shoulder, and he could feel her trembling under his palm, but she didn't hide or cower, just stood straight and met the stares of the assembled nobility with a dignity that would have been impressive in someone 3 times her age. One of his vampire advisors, an ancient creature named Cassian, who'd served since the beginning of Alaric's reign, stepped forward with the careful movements of someone approaching a dangerous animal. "Your Majesty," Cassian said, his tone respectful but firm. "These reforms are admirable in intention, but the human servants will see this as weakness. They'll interpret your compassion as an opportunity to demand more and more until the entire social structure collapses." Alaric looked at this vampire who'd been advising him for over 200 years. This creature who'd helped him build a kingdom on the assumption that power required distance and that caring about those beneath you was a liability, and he felt nothing but contempt for the philosophy they'd shared for so long. "Let them see it as justice," Alaric said clearly. "Let them see that their king finally opened his eyes to what was happening in his own house. We've built our comfort on their starvation, and that ends today. If you can't support these changes, then you're welcome to leave my service." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable and unprecedented, because Alaric had never dismissed a vampire advisor, and doing so now would signal just how serious he was about this transformation. Cassian's face went through several expressions before settling on resignation, and he bowed and said he would of course support whatever his king decided. But the damage was done. The message sent that loyalty now required supporting reforms that many in this room found unconscionable. The steward stepped forward then, an elderly human who'd managed the castle's operations for 40 years, and he removed the chain of office from around his neck with shaking hands. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot in good conscience continue to serve if everything I've spent my life building is to be torn down. The systems we have in place exist for good reasons. They maintain order and efficiency. And while I'm sorry for the individual hardship cases, radical change will create chaos." Alaric accepted the chain of office without comment, letting the steward's resignation speak for itself, and he watched the old man walk out of the throne room with his head held high, convinced apparently that he was the one with principles, while Alaric was the one abandoning them. Several nobles followed him out, their exits theatrical statements of protest, and Alaric let them go, because anyone who found equal food rations unconscionable wasn't someone he wanted in his court anyway. The servants along the walls were utterly silent, watching this impossible scene unfold, their king defending one of their children against the combined opposition of the entire noble class. And Alaric could see the exact moment when understanding dawned, when they realized this wasn't political theater but genuine commitment to change. Margaret was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth as she stared at her daughter standing proud beside the vampire king, and other servants were beginning to cry too, decades or centuries of resignation and accepted suffering cracking under the sudden, shocking possibility that things might actually get better. Alaric continued laying out his reforms, adding details about investigation committees and new administrative structures and timelines for implementation, his voice never wavering, even as more nobles registered their disapproval through pointed silence or barely concealed sneers. He announced that Emma would be educated alongside noble children, that she would have chambers in the family wing of the castle, that anyone who treated her with anything less than full respect would answer to him personally. And each declaration sent fresh shockwaves through the assembled crowd. When he finally finished, the throne room was split clearly into factions, those who were horrified by what he'd announced, and those who were cautiously, fearfully hopeful that he actually meant it. Lord Hadrian recovered enough to ask the question that was clearly on many minds, whether the king truly intended to overturn centuries of tradition for one child, and Alaric's response was to pull Emma slightly forward so everyone could see her clearly. "This child was eating garbage in my pantry while we feasted on delicacies we didn't bother to finish," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Her father was executed for stealing bread to feed her when she was 3 years old. Executed under laws I created and never questioned because I was too comfortable to care about their consequences. Her mother works 16 hours a day and gives her own food to her daughter because our systems don't account for the basic humanity of keeping children fed." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled nobility, making eye contact with as many as possible. If you find addressing this unconscionable, he continued, if equal food rations and education for servants' children strike you as radical overreach, then examine your own conscience and ask what kind of society requires children to starve so that adults can have third helpings of dishes they don't even finish. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Emma's quiet breathing and the distant sounds of the castle going about its business outside these walls. And Alaric knew that he'd just declared war on his own power structure, had made enemies of people who'd been allies for centuries, had destabilized everything in pursuit of something he couldn't even fully articulate. But looking down at Emma, at this child who'd almost died from the casual cruelty of systems he'd permitted through indifference, he felt certain in a way he hadn't felt about anything in decades. The throne room began to empty slowly, nobles and advisors filing out in shocked silence, some throwing venomous looks at Emma as they passed, while others carefully kept their faces neutral, and the servants remained frozen along the walls until Alaric dismissed them, watching as they scattered like leaves in wind, no doubt rushing to spread word of what had just happened to every corner of the castle. Soon only Margaret remained, standing alone in the vast empty space, and Alaric beckoned her forward, watching as she approached the throne with the hesitant steps of someone expecting punishment rather than reward. When she reached the base of the dais, she fell to her knees, trying to thank him through tears, and Alaric descended from his throne and lifted her to her feet himself, another gesture that would have been unthinkable yesterday. "Your daughter saved my life today," he told her. Even though Emma was the one who'd nearly died, she reminded me of something I'd forgotten, something I needed to remember, and I owe you both a debt I can never fully repay. Margaret looked at him with incomprehension, unable to process how the most powerful creature in the kingdom could possibly owe anything to a laundry maid and her starving child. But Alaric just smiled and told her to take Emma to the family wing, where chambers were being prepared, to rest and eat and not worry about work for at least a week. As he watched them leave, Emma's small hand clutched in her mother's ruined one. Alaric felt the weight of what he'd just set in motion settling onto his shoulders, and he knew that the real battle was just beginning. That declaration was easy compared to implementation, that he'd made powerful enemies today who would not accept these changes without a fight. But for the first time in 3 centuries, he felt like he was moving toward something rather than away from it. Felt like the 9-year-old boy who'd watched his father hang might finally understand why he'd survived when so many others hadn't, and that made whatever came next feel bearable, even necessary, even right. Alaric had known the retaliation would come, had been waiting for it with the patient certainty of someone who'd survived 3 centuries of political maneuvering and assassination plots. But he hadn't expected them to move so quickly or to target Emma directly instead of trying to undermine his authority through more subtle means. He'd posted guards outside her new chambers in the family wing, had assigned his most trusted vampires to patrol the corridors at night, had even implemented new security protocols for the entire castle, but apparently he'd underestimated how desperate his enemies had become and how little they cared about the consequences of failure. The attack came on the third night after his declaration, when the castle had just begun to settle into an uneasy acceptance of the new reality, servants cautiously eating better meals, while nobles seethed in their private chambers and plotted in whispered conversations they thought no one could overhear. Alaric had been in his study reviewing the first reports from the investigation committees when he felt it, a disturbance in the air that his vampire senses registered as wrongness, the particular quality of violence happening somewhere nearby. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, his body responding to 300 years of honed instincts, and he covered the distance to Emma's chambers in seconds, his speed turning the corridor into a blur as he raced toward the source of the disturbance. Her door was ajar when it should have been locked, the guards who were supposed to be stationed outside lying in spreading pools of blood with their throats cut, and Alaric felt rage ignite in his chest as he kicked the door open hard enough to tear it from its hinges. The bedroom had been transformed into a battlefield, furniture overturned and curtains shredded. The pretty pastel walls that had been chosen to make a child feel safe, now splattered with blood that looked black in the candlelight. 3 assassins in dark clothing were in the room, professionals by the way they moved. And Emma was backed into a corner clutching a fireplace poker like a weapon, even though she was so weak from her recent illness that she could barely hold it upright. Her nightgown was torn, and there was a cut on her arm that was bleeding freely, and the assassins were circling her like wolves with a wounded deer, taking their time because they thought they had all night to complete their mission. They didn't hear Alaric enter, were so focused on their prey that they missed the apex predator arriving behind them, and he used that moment of inattention to grab the nearest one by the skull and twist hard enough that the neck broke with a sound like green wood snapping. The body was still falling when Alaric moved to the second assassin, this one fast enough to register the threat and draw a blade. But human speed was nothing compared to vampire speed, and Alaric caught the wrist holding the weapon and squeezed until bones shattered into powder. The assassin's scream was cut short when Alaric's other hand punched through his ribcage and tore out his heart, the organ still beating as Alaric dropped it onto the floor and turned to face the third attacker. This one was smarter or more experienced, had used the seconds Alaric spent killing his companions to put Emma between himself and the vampire king, holding her in front of him like a shield with a blade pressed to her throat. Alaric froze, every muscle in his body going rigid as he calculated angles and distances and probabilities, his mind running through 100 scenarios where he killed the assassin without getting Emma killed in the process. The man was speaking, saying something about messages and warnings, and how the nobility wouldn't accept a servant child being elevated above her station. But Alaric wasn't listening to the words, was instead watching the minute movements of the hand holding the blade, waiting for the fraction of a second of inattention that would give him an opening. Emma was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at Alaric with eyes that begged him to save her, and he could hear her heart racing, could smell her fear mixing with the copper tang of blood already spilled. The assassin made his mistake when he shifted his grip slightly, adjusting his hold on Emma to make his threats more emphatic, and in that microsecond of movement, Alaric struck, covering the distance between them faster than human eyes could track, and grabbing the wrist holding the blade. He wrenched it away from Emma's throat, felt the satisfying crack of breaking bones, and was pulling Emma to safety when the assassin's other hand moved, a backup weapon appearing from nowhere and slashing across Emma's side in a desperate final attack. The blade cut deep, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding in frightening quantities. But worse was the smell that rose from the wound, something chemical and wrong that Alaric's vampire senses identified as poison even before Emma gasped and her legs buckled. He caught her with one arm while his other hand found the assassin's throat, and he squeezed, feeling cartilage collapse and blood vessels rupture, his fingers digging through flesh until they found spine and tore the head from the body in a spray of gore that painted the walls and ceiling. The corpse fell, and Alaric was already moving, lowering Emma to the floor as gently as he could, while his mind raced through everything he knew about poisons and toxins and how fast they could kill. Her lips were already turning blue, her breathing becoming labored, and the wound in her side was turning black around the edges as the poison spread through her bloodstream. Alaric screamed for his physician, his voice carrying through the entire castle with enough force that windows shattered, and then he was gathering Emma into his arms, pressing his hand over the wound to slow the bleeding, even though he knew the real danger was already inside her. She looked up at him with eyes that were starting to lose focus, her small hand finding his and gripping with strength she shouldn't have had. "Don't let Mama see me like this," she whispered, her voice already thready and weak. "She'll blame herself. She always blames herself when bad things happen." Alaric felt something breaking inside his chest, some last piece of the armor he'd worn for centuries finally crumbling into dust. "You're not dying," he said, putting every ounce of authority he possessed into the words as though he could command her body to obey. "I forbid it. Do you understand me? You're not allowed to die." Emma's laugh was barely a breath, more of a wheeze that made her whole body convulse. "You can't command death," she said, "even if you're a king. Papa told me that before the soldiers came, he said even kings have to bow to death eventually." The words hit Alaric like physical blows, each one a reminder of his failure, of how he'd let her father die and was now watching his daughter follow him into darkness. "I've commanded death for centuries," Alaric said, his voice breaking on the words. "Tonight I'm commanding life. Stay with me, Emma. Please, you have to stay with me." His physician burst into the room, followed by assistants carrying bags of supplies, and they fell to their knees beside Emma, examining the wound with practiced efficiency, while Alaric held her and felt her heartbeat growing weaker against his chest. The physician's face went pale as he identified the poison, and he looked up at Alaric with an expression that contained more bad news than any verbal report could convey. "The poison is beyond my skill," the physician said quietly. "It's a blend designed specifically to kill quickly, shutting down organs one by one until the heart stops. I can slow it, but I can't stop it. She has perhaps an hour, maybe less." Alaric stared at this man who'd served him faithfully for decades, who'd saved countless lives and cured impossible diseases, and he wanted to kill him just for delivering news he couldn't accept. "There has to be something," Alaric said, his hands shaking as he held Emma's convulsing body. "Some antidote or counteragent or magical cure. I don't care what it costs or what it requires. Fix this." The physician hesitated, his eyes dropping to Emma's face before returning to Alaric's. "There is one option," he said slowly. "Vampire blood has healing properties that can cure almost any poison. If she drinks from you, the transformation would burn the toxin from her system before it could kill her. But the cost would be her humanity. She would become what you are." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, offering salvation at a price that might be worse than death, and Alaric felt the full weight of the choice crushing down on him. He could save Emma's life by turning her into a vampire, could guarantee she would never starve or suffer or die from poison, but he would also be condemning her to an eternity as a creature that fed on blood and couldn't walk in sunlight, taking from her the very humanity that made her worth saving. He looked down at her face, saw her lips turning darker blue, saw the light beginning to fade from her eyes, and he knew he was out of time. Emma seemed to understand what was being discussed because her hand tightened around his and she shook her head minutely. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't make me into a monster. Mama wouldn't recognize me, and I'd rather die as myself than live as something else." The simple dignity of her refusal destroyed him, this child choosing death over transformation because she understood instinctively what it had taken Alaric 3 centuries to figure out, that power without humanity was just another kind of death. He pulled her closer, feeling her heartbeat stuttering against his chest, and he made a decision that terrified him more than any battle he'd ever fought. "I won't turn you," he promised, his voice raw with emotion he'd forgotten he could feel. "But I won't let you die either. There has to be another way. There has to be." He looked at his physician with eyes that had gone completely red, his vampire nature emerging fully as desperation overrode control. "Find another way," he commanded. "Use whatever resources you need. Consult every healer and witch and magical practitioner in the kingdom. But find a way to save her that doesn't require transformation." The physician nodded and began shouting orders to his assistants, sending them running for books and supplies and other healers, and Alaric was left holding Emma as her body continued to shut down. But even as he held her, another part of his mind was moving, was remembering his earlier rage and the promise he'd made to find every conspirator involved in this attack. He called for his captain of the guard, and when the vampire arrived, Alaric gave orders in a voice that allowed no argument or mercy. "Lock down the castle," he said. "No one enters or leaves. Arrest everyone who was named in the investigation reports as being involved in kitchen corruption. Arrest Lord Hadrian and anyone known to associate with him regularly, and bring them all to the dungeons. I'll deal with them personally once Emma is stable. The captain saluted and disappeared, and within minutes, Alaric could hear the sounds of his orders being carried out, boots running through corridors and doors being kicked in, and voices raised in protest and fear. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the sky, and the timing felt almost prophetic, as though the heavens themselves were responding to the violence happening inside the castle walls. Emma's convulsions were getting worse, her entire body seizing as the poison attacked her nervous system, and the physician was working frantically, trying different combinations of herbs and tinctures, while consulting books that promised ancient remedies. Alaric held her through each seizure, whispering promises he didn't know if he could keep, telling her about all the things they would do once she recovered, the education she would receive and the life she would live, and how he would make sure she never wanted for anything. Margaret arrived at some point, having apparently fought past the guards to reach her daughter, and Alaric made room for her to kneel beside them, watching as the mother gathered her dying child into her arms. Margaret was beyond tears, beyond words, just holding Emma and rocking her gently while making soft sounds of comfort. And Alaric felt like an intruder on this moment of intimate grief. But then Margaret looked at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears, and she said something that cut through his despair like a blade. "Save her," she commanded, "whatever it takes, whatever the cost. I don't care if she becomes a vampire or a demon or something without a name. I want my daughter to live. Do you understand me? Make whatever choice you have to make, but don't let her die." The permission released something in Alaric, some restraint he'd been holding because he'd thought turning Emma would be a violation. But if her mother was asking for it, then maybe it wasn't his choice to make at all. He looked at the physician, ready to give the order, but the man was suddenly excited, pulling an ancient tome from his bag and reading frantically. "There's a ritual," the physician said, his voice shaking with urgency. "Forbidden magic from before the vampire covens formed. A way to transfer life force from an immortal to a mortal. Without full transformation, it would link your lifespans. She would age slowly and live for centuries but remain fundamentally human. The process is dangerous and might kill you both, but it's the only option besides turning her." Alaric didn't hesitate, didn't stop to consider the implications or risks, just demanded to know what the ritual required. The physician listed ingredients and preparations, most of which were already in his supplies, and Alaric's guards were sent running to fetch the rest, while the physician began drawing symbols on the floor in Emma's blood mixed with ash from the fireplace. The ritual would require Alaric to open his own veins and let Emma drink his blood while he spoke words in a language older than the castle itself, channeling his immortal essence into her dying body and permanently binding them together. If it worked, she would survive. If it failed, they would both die, and there was no way to know which outcome was more likely. Emma was barely conscious when they began, her body racked with convulsions that were destroying her from the inside, and Alaric laid her in the center of the symbol circle, while the physician chanted preparatory incantations. He used his own fangs to open his wrist, vampire blood welling up black in the candlelight, and he pressed the wound to Emma's lips while beginning the ritual words. The language felt wrong in his mouth, syllables that predated vampirism and touched on forces older and more fundamental than anything he'd encountered in 3 centuries of immortal existence. And as he spoke, he felt his life force beginning to flow into Emma. Felt his own immortality stretching to encompass her mortality in a way that made him dizzy and sick. Emma's eyes flew open, going completely black as the ritual took hold, and her body arched off the floor as vampire blood and ancient magic warred with the poison in her system. Alaric kept speaking even though it felt like the words were tearing him apart from the inside, kept feeding her his blood even though he could feel his own strength draining at an alarming rate, and he distantly heard the physician urging him to continue, to finish the incantation no matter what. The storm outside intensified, lightning striking so close that the thunder was instantaneous, and in the flashes of light, Alaric saw Emma's body beginning to glow, a faint luminescence that grew brighter as the ritual progressed. The poison was being burned away. He could see it happening, black veins receding as his blood pushed the toxin out. But the cost was staggering, his vision was blurring, and his immortal strength was failing for the first time since his transformation. He finished the final words of the ritual and collapsed beside Emma, both of them unconscious before they hit the floor. And the last thing Alaric heard before darkness claimed him was Margaret screaming and the physicians shouting for help. And then there was nothing but void, and the distant hope that when he woke Emma would wake too. Alaric woke to pain, which was itself remarkable because vampires didn't feel pain the way humans did, their immortal bodies too divorced from mortal sensation to register anything short of catastrophic damage. But whatever the ritual had done to him had stripped away some of that immunity and left him feeling raw and vulnerable in ways he hadn't experienced since his transformation 3 centuries ago. He opened his eyes to find himself on the floor of Emma's chambers, the ritual circles still visible in dried blood and ash around him. And his first coherent thought was terror that he'd wake alone, that Emma had died while he was unconscious, and he'd failed her the way he'd failed her father. But then he heard breathing beside him, steady and strong, and he turned his head to find Emma lying next to him, her chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of genuine sleep rather than the shallow gasps of someone dying from poison. The wound in her side was closed, healed completely except for a thin silver scar that looked like it had been there for years rather than hours, and her lips were pink again, the deathly blue tint burned away by whatever magic had passed between them. Alaric pushed himself up on shaking arms, his vampire strength reduced to something barely above human levels, and he crawled the few feet to Emma's side to check her pulse with fingers that trembled against her throat. Her heartbeat was strong and steady, her skin warm with life rather than the clammy cold of approaching death, and relief hit him so hard that he had to close his eyes and just breathe for a moment, letting the knowledge that she'd survived wash over him in waves. The physician was asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted from the night's efforts, and Margaret was curled on the floor on Emma's other side, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder as though afraid she might disappear if contact was broken. Dawn was breaking outside the windows, warm golden light flooding the room and illuminating the destruction from the assassination attempt, the overturned furniture, and blood-stained walls that would need to be cleaned or replaced before this could be a child's bedroom again. But those were concerns for later. Right now, all that mattered was that Emma was breathing and her mother was beside her, and the three of them had survived a night that should have ended in tragedy. Alaric sat back against the wall, conserving his diminished strength, and he examined the connection the ritual had created between himself and Emma, feeling it like a thread of light running from his chest to hers, linking their life forces in a way that was permanent and irrevocable. He could sense her now in a way that had nothing to do with his vampire abilities, could feel her heartbeat as though it were his own, could perceive the steady flow of her thoughts, even if he couldn't read them clearly, and he knew that for as long as he existed, she would exist too, their lifespans bound together by magic older than the vampire covens. The implications were staggering. Emma would age slowly, living for centuries instead of decades, remaining human in all ways except mortality, and Alaric had no idea what that would mean for either of them in practical terms. Would she resent him for taking away the natural human lifespan? For condemning her to watch everyone she knew grow old and die while she barely aged? Would she come to see this gift as a curse the way he sometimes saw his own immortality? But then Emma's eyes opened, focusing on him with clarity that proved her mind had survived the poison intact. And she smiled, just a small curve of her lips that transformed her entire face. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming but unmistakably alive. "I thought maybe I dreamed you, thought maybe I was already dead, and this was just what dying felt like." Alaric found himself smiling back, something he couldn't remember doing genuinely in longer than he could recall. I'm here, he confirmed. And so are you. The ritual worked. You're going to be fine. Emma's hand found his, her small fingers wrapping around his thumb the way they had that first night in the pantry, and she asked the question he'd been dreading. Will I turn into a vampire? Will I need to drink blood and hide from the sun and live forever as something that's not human anymore? Her voice held fear but also curiosity, the resilience of a child who'd survived too much to be completely broken by one more impossible thing. Alaric shook his head, choosing his words carefully because she deserved truth even if that truth was complicated. No, he said gently. You'll be exactly who you are, human in every way that matters, but you'll live much longer than most humans do. You'll age slowly over centuries instead of decades, and you'll be connected to me in ways I don't fully understand yet. But you won't need blood and the sun won't hurt you, and you'll still be Emma. Just Emma, for a very long time. She absorbed this information with the seriousness of someone much older, her eyes searching his face for deception or false comfort, and apparently finding neither. Will you teach me to be a good queen? She asked. Because if I'm going to live for centuries, I should probably learn how to do something useful with all that time. The question caught him completely off guard. The casual assumption that her extended lifespan should be spent in service rather than simply existing, and Alaric felt something crack open in his chest, some final barrier between who he'd been and who he might become. You'll teach me to be a good king, he said, his voice thick with emotions he was still learning to name again. I've spent 300 years forgetting how to see people as human. You'll remind me every day what that means. You'll be my conscience and my heir, and my redemption all wrapped into one stubborn child. Emma laughed, the sound weak but genuine, and the noise woke Margaret, who sat up with a gasp and immediately pulled her daughter into her arms, checking her over with hands that shook from exhaustion and relief. Mama, Emma said into her mother's shoulder, I'm okay. The king saved me. He did magic, and now I'm going to live for a really long time. Margaret looked at Alaric over her daughter's head, her eyes full of questions and gratitude, and something that might have been fear, because what parent wouldn't be afraid of a vampire king who'd just permanently altered their child's lifespan? Alaric met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see, and after a long moment, Margaret spoke. Why save us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We're nothing, just a maid and her daughter. You could have let Emma die and found another cause to champion, another symbol to justify your reforms. Why risk yourself for people who can't give you anything in return? The question deserved an honest answer, deserved more than political platitudes or comfortable lies, and Alaric found himself speaking from a place of truth he usually kept carefully hidden. You're everything I forgot I was, he said, everything I need to remember, if I'm going to be worthy of ruling anyone. I became a monster to escape powerlessness, and in the process I created the exact conditions I'd suffered under. Watching Emma almost die because of systems I built or permitted was like watching my own father die all over again, like being 9 years old and helpless in the face of cruelty that called itself justice. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to put 3 centuries of buried trauma into words that would make sense. I can't undo what happened to your husband, he continued. I can't bring back Thomas or erase the harm my indifference has caused, but I can make sure it never happens again. I can use whatever time I have left to build something better than what exists now, and Emma will be the proof that change is possible, that even monsters can remember how to be human if they have the right teacher. Margaret was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter, and processed words that reshaped her understanding of the vampire king she'd served for years without really seeing. She reached out hesitantly, her ruined laundry hands touching Alaric's arm in a gesture that was simultaneously grateful and comforting, and he covered her hand with his own. The 3 of them connected in a moment that felt sacred, despite happening in a room still stained with assassin blood. Emma's first question after the emotion settled was characteristically practical, asking if her mother could eat dinner with them tonight, and Alaric found himself laughing through tears he hadn't known he was crying. The absurdity and perfection of a child who'd almost died, asking about dinner plans, striking him as the most human thing imaginable. "Yes," he said. "Your mother can eat dinner with us every night if she wants. In fact, I'm making it a new rule that families eat together whenever possible. No more separation between servants and nobility at mealtimes. Everyone eats the same food in the same spaces, because apparently it takes almost losing you for me to realize how insane our previous arrangements were." The physician woke at some point during this conversation, immediately checking Emma's vital signs and declaring the ritual a complete success, her body showing no lingering effects of the poison and the life force connection stable and strong. He warned that there might be unexpected consequences as the magic settled, that linking a vampire's immortality to a human child was unprecedented, and they would be navigating unknown territory. But for now, Emma was healthy and whole, and that was all that mattered. Alaric gave orders for the room to be cleaned and restored, for Emma and Margaret to be moved to better chambers in the family wing where they could stay together, and for breakfast to be brought immediately because both mother and daughter needed proper nutrition after the trauma of the previous night. While servants scrambled to fulfill his commands, Alaric sat with Emma and Margaret and felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, something that took him several minutes to identify as hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to escape their circumstances, but the quiet hope of someone building towards something better, the knowledge that tomorrow might be an improvement over today, and that the effort required to make that happen was worthwhile. He was terrified, absolutely paralyzed by the responsibility of raising Emma, of being worthy of the trust she and Margaret were placing in him, of not failing them the way he'd failed so many others through indifference and distance. But he was also grateful for the chance to remember what it felt like to care about individual people rather than abstract concepts of order and tradition, grateful that Emma's stubbornness and Margaret's fierce love had broken through walls he'd spent 3 centuries building. The castle was waking below them, servants beginning their morning routines and discovering that everything had changed overnight, that the assassins who'd targeted the king's ward had been caught and executed, that investigations into the conspiracy had resulted in arrests of nobles and staff alike, that the reforms announced days ago were being implemented immediately rather than gradually. Alaric could hear the confusion and excitement in distant voices, could sense the castle itself adjusting to a new reality where children mattered and servants had rights, and the comfortable cruelty of the old order was being dismantled piece by piece. Breakfast arrived on silver trays, carried by servants who kept their eyes carefully averted, as though afraid to witness the impossible scene of a king eating with a maid and her daughter. But Alaric made them set up a proper table by the windows, where dawn light streamed in warm and golden, and he insisted that Emma and Margaret sit with him as equals, that they serve themselves before he touched any food, that this meal be a template for how things would work going forward. Emma ate with the focused intensity of someone whose body was still recovering from starvation and poison, working her way through eggs and bread and fruit with single-minded determination, and Margaret watched her daughter eat with an expression that cycled between joy and disbelief, as though she still couldn't quite accept that this was real and permanent, rather than a dream that would shatter at any moment. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the three of them processing the events of the previous night and the new reality those events had created. And Alaric found himself cataloging details he would have missed before, the way Emma's hair caught the morning light, the unconscious grace of Margaret's movements despite her exhaustion, the simple pleasure of sharing food with people who mattered to him. When they'd finished eating, Emma asked what would happen next, her practical mind already moving past survival to planning, and Alaric outlined the changes that were already in motion. The corrupt kitchen staff had been dismissed and would face criminal charges for embezzlement, their replacements chosen from servants who'd demonstrated integrity during the investigations. Lord Hadrian and the nobles involved in the assassination plot were being exiled, their properties seized and redistributed to fund the new education programs for servants' children. The sweeping reforms announced in the throne room were being implemented immediately: equal food rations and dedicated children's mealtimes and oversight committees to prevent future abuse. And Alaric had appointed a council of both nobles and servants to advise on further changes needed to make the castle truly equitable. Emma would begin her education within the week, tutored alongside children from both noble and servant families in a deliberate mixing that would have been unthinkable days ago. And Margaret would be relieved of her laundry duties and given a position as head of household welfare, using her intimate knowledge of servant conditions to identify problems and implement solutions. The old steward's resignation had created an opportunity to restructure the entire administrative system, and Alaric intended to build something new from the ground up, something that valued compassion alongside efficiency and measured success by the well-being of the least powerful rather than the comfort of the most privileged. It was ambitious to the point of madness, attempting to overturn centuries of established practice in a matter of weeks, and Alaric knew there would be resistance and setbacks, and probably more assassination attempts before the new order stabilized. But looking at Emma, at this child who'd survived starvation and poison and dark magic to sit at his breakfast table asking intelligent questions about governance and social reform, he felt certain in a way he hadn't felt about anything in decades. The sun climbed higher, flooding the room with light that turned Emma's silver scar into a badge of survival. And outside the windows, Alaric could see the castle grounds coming alive with morning activity that looked superficially the same as always, but was fundamentally different in ways that would take time to fully manifest. Servants walked with straighter backs, their steps less hurried because they knew they would be fed properly regardless of how quickly they completed their tasks. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter carrying through the open windows, and Alaric realized with a start that he'd never heard children laughing in his castle before, had never noticed their absence, because he'd never really seen them as people deserving of joy. Margaret was watching him, her expression thoughtful, and when she spoke, her voice held a question that cut to the heart of everything. "What happens when the initial excitement fades?" she asked. "When maintaining these changes becomes difficult, and people start arguing that the old ways were better? How do you keep from sliding back into comfortable cruelty when there's no immediate crisis forcing you to care?" It was the right question, the essential question, because Alaric knew that systemic change required sustained effort rather than dramatic gestures, that the real work would be in the daily choices and small decisions that either reinforced new values or eroded them back toward familiar patterns. He thought about it carefully before answering, wanting to give Margaret and Emma truth, rather than reassuring platitudes. "I think," he said slowly, "that's why Emma's survival matters, beyond just saving one life. She's going to be here for centuries, growing up in this castle and becoming part of its foundation. She'll be a living reminder of why we made these changes. Every time I'm tempted to compromise or backslide, I'll see her and remember what almost happened. Remember that comfort built on suffering isn't really comfort at all." He reached across the table and took Emma's hand, feeling the life force connection humming between them. "You're my anchor," he told her. "My conscience made external. You'll grow up learning to rule with compassion, and when I'm gone, you'll continue this work. You'll be the proof that change can be permanent if we're willing to fight for it every single day." Emma squeezed his hand, her young face serious with understanding beyond her years. "I won't let you forget," she promised, "even when it's hard, even when people tell you the old ways were better. I'll remind you why we're doing this. I'll be stubborn and annoying until you remember." Alaric laughed, the sound genuine and free, and he realized this was what redemption felt like. Not a single dramatic moment of transformation, but a continuous choice to be better, to remember, to care about individuals rather than abstractions. The old order was dying. He could feel it in the changed atmosphere of the castle, in the way servants met his eyes now, instead of staring at the floor. in the children's laughter drifting through windows that had only ever carried the sounds of adult industry before. Something new was being born, something fragile and hopeful and terrifying in its implications, and Alaric was choosing to nurture it despite the cost, despite the resistance, despite his own fear of failure. He looked at Emma and Margaret, at these two people who'd accidentally saved him by letting him save them, and he felt the weight of 300 years of accumulated distance and indifference beginning to lift, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to purpose. The sun continued rising, bathing the castle in warm light that promised a new day unlike any that had come before, and Alaric sat with a maid and her daughter eating breakfast as equals and planning a future that would require every ounce of courage and commitment he possessed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt ready for whatever came next.